Hey there guys, it's Metro, and this video is going to be one that's been highly requested. We're going to be making a tier list of all the damage dealers in 5-mans, specifically Mythic Plus trajectory. The tier list is going to be comprised of classes instead of specs. The reason I'm doing it this way is because the things I'm basing this tier list on are very wholly controlled to the actual class itself now, with one small exception. For example, Warlock, the criteria I'm basing them on is present through all 3 specs, so at that point it's up to you to choose whichever spec you're more prepared for, which one you could do more damage for, or perhaps which one you simply prefer. With that in mind, we're going to pay less attention to actual damage output. Obviously, some specs can deal more damage than other specs, but since you have the random affixes each week and you can continue to get gear, unlike in challenge modes in the past where your gear was scaled down, damage output should be relative across all of these specs, provided they all know what they're doing. And we're going to focus more instead on the actual kit, the tools available, and the ways it could help the dungeon progress. So, brief disclaimer before we begin. This is my opinion as of October 6th, 2016, patch 7.0, based on my experience that I've had in dungeons and the experience I've seen firsthand of others. So if you do not agree with these opinions, I would love to hear why down in the comments, but otherwise let's get right into it. We're going to start at the top and work our way down, going from strongest to weakest damage dealers. So tier 1, number 1 overall is Death Knight. Of course, like all of the damage dealers in the first 2 or 3 tiers, everybody has exceptional AoE damage, and don't forget that is a huge part of dungeons nowadays, even in Mythic Plus, but it is their utility that brings them all the way to the top of this list. They first of all have grips, both Unholy and Frost, and then of course Unholy has the pet grip as well. They have a battle res, which is absolutely invaluable, and they have of course strong AoE, and then of mind controlling undead in some cases can be a very nice damage increase and situational increase for that. So I would prefer Unholy if it was me, but now that the Frost buffs are in, they are a lot better than they used to be, and both specs seem perfectly viable to me. The main thing the Death Knight has to be aware of is how to grip properly. It's an incredible DPS gain when the mobs can stay close together, and of course battle resing properly as well is their number 1 priority. Number 2 in tier 1 is Elemental Shaman, and this is the one exception on the entire list where we're going to examine a spec instead of a class. It's because they contain 2 things that Enhanced does not. And the first thing is Ancestral Guidance, AG as it's known. Very important thing to have if you remember from last expansion and even the previous one as well, MOP. This type of splash healing for the group was insanely strong, allows the healer to have a lot more flexibility, and now that healers can do as much damage as they can, that becomes a premium element to bring to a dungeon. The other thing they have that Enhanced does not is a knockdown on Earthquake Totems damage. This seems a minor thing to most people, but it's actually incredibly useful, especially in a few packs where a lot of casters are present, but it also disrupts swing time, so overall a DPS loss for these mobs and makes the groups a lot more manageable if you're trying to pull larger packs. Then they are of course ranged. If you ask me, that's a plus over any melee in a 5-man, but they also still have Onk, which saves a battle res. They have Lust, which is incredibly important for beating times, and they also have very good AoE that is controlled around strong burst. And the final class on the tier 1 is Hunter. Especially as a ranged damage dealer, Hunter has always been very flexible. They've always had a high spot in any challenge mode tier list, but it is the same for Mythic Plus. They contain once again a battle res and a lust pet across all 3 specs. They have strong burst damage across all 3 specs, and they still for the most part have binding shot and misdirects. These are 2 things that can go a long way in 5-man. Misdirect as well is especially something that a lot of people don't take full advantage of in 5-mans. It allows you to pull things quicker, pull things easier, and control the pace of combat much better. So Hunter, especially Beast Mastery, is what I would prefer. Stampede is probably my favorite DPS CD in all of 5-man content, but Marksman is incredibly strong overall, and both can be played to some degree. Survival, not so much. I would exclude them from the list if I could at all, because bringing a melee Hunter seems counterproductive to me. So the first 3 damage dealers we spoke about are the 3 that I would bring in a vacuum if all things were equal. But of course, this does not mean the subsequent tiers are bad in any way. Somebody has to be top and somebody has to be bottom. And don't forget, in Legion, the difference is a lot less severe than it has been in the past. So in the next tier, tier number 2, number 1 is Warlock. Warlock has recently been buffed to a great degree, and they were even strong before that, to be fair. They have some of the most flexible survivability in the entire game, extremely durable. They could mind control demons, which in some cases is extremely useful. They have very strong AoE, especially Demo and Affliction, and they have a battle res, which is unbelievably important. Now, if it was up to me, I would bring a Demo Warlock, but all three specs have strengths and weaknesses that vary upon the things we spoke about. They all have a different form of strong AoE, like for example, Afflictions is a little bit different than Demo, be applicable in different scenarios, and they all have a little bit different terms of survivability. But when you're talking about a class that could battle res and basically keep itself alive through anything, this has to be towards the top of the list. Number 2 in tier 2 is of course Windy Walker Jr. And as anybody who's played with a Windwalker recently knows, they have some of the highest potential for AoE bursts in the video game, but they are melee. So whenever I consider melee for something like this, they have to have something special about them. DK was number 1 overall because they have grips and battle res. So any melee that does not have a utility like that is going to have to be extremely mobile, and they are such. The reason mobility is so important in dungeons, as I mentioned in a few other videos, is that every time you are out of range of mobs, you are doing less damage as a group overall. So when melee has to be up in range of mobs, and range could be far away, the range is simply higher DPS. But when you have the mobility Windwalker does, and of course the exponential AoE they have, there's absolutely no reason to consider them otherwise. They also have a very good AoE stun in Leg Sweep. It remains being one of the strongest abilities in 5-mans in terms of utility, and because of that they are number 2 on tier 2. And number 3 on tier 2 is Havoc Demon Hunter. Of course, flavor of the month, but incredibly strong. They did recently receive a small nerf to their single target, but their AoE remains to be one of the strongest in the game, if not the strongest burst AoE of any damage dealer. So of course they are going to be in tier 2 almost solely for that. But they also have a stun like we mentioned with Windwalker, and they also have mobility. Just like I said with Windwalker, mobility is incredibly important, and their mobility is even greater to some degree. The only thing that stifles them a bit is that sometimes they are too mobile, and there is a situation or two in a dungeon where moving around that much can actually hurt your group. But overall, they have incredible AoE, and if it's only for that, you should definitely consider Havoc as one of the top damage dealers. Tier 3 now, we're getting into classes and specs that are a bit superfluous to others that we've already mentioned. For example, number 1 on the list is Mage, especially Fire. This is a good case here where the other 2 specs simply aren't able to compete, but they're not terrible, but Fire is just kind of superior. But I have them in tier 3, even though they're one of the strongest damage dealers in Mythic Plus, because their utility is superfluous to say Elemental or even a Hunter or anything else really. They only bring Lust, but they do have incredible damage, but that's not enough for me to elevate them up the list for my concerns. Obviously, if you're trying to push like crazy undergeared Mythic Plus 15s or something like that, then you probably need to be worried way more about damage. But for me, looking at the long haul, I look at Mage as a mid tier, mostly because they have Lust, of course. They're very durable as well. It's something that can't go without saying. Being able to blink out of mechanics, being able to ice block, things like that are incredible, and Invis still has a place as well. But regardless, they're one of the best damage dealers all around as Fire. Number 2 in tier 3 is going to be Rogue. Rogue is a very versatile class, always has been. Outlaw is playing exceptionally well in Mythic Pluses right now because of their insanely high RNG driven burst AoE, but they could also fall into other categories like a single target nuker like Assassination, or even Subtlety as well can be played. It really just depends on what you need as a rogue and what your comp needs as a rogue. But they're also extremely durable, probably the most durable melee, and they have a high mobility skill cap. If played properly, they can be one of the best mobility damage dealers in the game, but if not, they're kind of below Demon Hunter and Monk. Regardless, Outlaw is exceptionally good. It does rely a lot on RNG, so I have to kind of drag it down a bit because of that, and they don't have any definite utility anymore with the removal of Shroud of Concealment, unfortunately. I don't know why they got rid of that, honestly, but if that was still in the game, they would be one of the best for sure. And the final one on tier 3 is Enhancement Shaman. Once again, superfluous in all ways, in my opinion, to Elemental. Elemental is simply better AoE, has better utility overall, and the same things Enhancement has and Ellie has as well. But they do have very strong single target burst. As you've seen in raids, they are one of the best single target burst specs right now. Very good damage overall. So they have very good sweeping cleave too. It's not terrible. Elemental is just a bit better burst, and the utility they have is simply better. But they still do have a stun, which is exceptional exceptionally important. They have Lust, which is exceptionally important, and an Ankh can save a wipe and also can save a battle res, so enhancement's not terrible. Finally, we come to tier 4. This is going to contain the remaining 4 classes, as I feel like they are all kind of just bottom tier. And number 1 on this final tier here is Warrior. Now, Warrior has some really nice damage overall. Arms and Fury both have very strong AoE and single target respectively, but both don't necessarily come in better than anyone else. Now, one thing they do have going for them is Shockwave, so they're always going to be considered because of that. Having Shockwave is very nice, and they also have a lot of mobility, so that's not too bad either. But simply looking at them next to, say, a Windwalker Monk is basically the same thing and simply better. So unless Warrior gets a buff in terms of like Blade Storm, those are things that really excelled them past other specs in challenge modes in the past. A very definitive niche for Blade Storm and big AoE pulls. That was Blade Storm's niche, and that's needed again, but unfortunately Warrior has kind of lost that. Number 2 on tier 4 is going to be Druid. Both Feral and Bombkin lack a definitive niche, very similarly to Warrior, but they do both contain one very strong situational use, and that is Battle Res. Battle Res is always going to be useful, so there's never a bad time to bring a Druid. It's just simply weaker than, say, a Warlock or a DK or basically anything else. Feral is a very good spec in raids right now, and Bombkin's not bad either, but there's just not a lot of synergy with how their damage is dealt over pack. Perhaps Feral will become better damage dealers when you're getting into mobs that are surviving for multiple seconds instead of just getting blown up in all the burst. But as of right now, unfortunately, even their mobility does not help me find them a home, and they're going to have to be down here at the bottom of the list. Number 3 on tier 4 is, of course, Paladin. Retribution especially. Unfortunately, they've been this way for a very long time in 5-mans. They have a lot of really cool utility for actual raids, and even when their damage is at the top, they just kind of don't fit in a 5-man group. Back when they had buffs and everything, it was the same way as well. Their buffs are just kind of superfluous and overwritten. So we're basically seeing the exact same thing here where we're at now. They don't do incredible AoE, they don't do incredible single targets, they don't have incredible utility, and they have no real viability in terms of battle reses or grips or anything like that. So they're down here for a very definitive reason. They're a jack of all trades but master of none. Lay on Hands and Bubble can keep you in some fight. They can be useful in a few dungeons. There's no doubt about that. Bubble is actually pretty good for 5-man progression, especially if it saves a wipe. But unfortunately, that's all they have. So sadly, Ret would need a very major retooling of their kit to be even considered. Even if they were the top damage spec in the game, I think I would still rather bring a melee that is either mobile, has a good stun, AoE stun, has good battle res, has grip, something like that. And finally, it wouldn't be a 5-man tier list without Shadow Priest at the bottom, sadly. I have to find it this way. There's just absolutely no utility they bring. I literally can't think of a single thing. I mean, VE and grip are really not useful in 5-mans at all. I really wish VE was better. If they were able to do like crazy exponential AoE like Elemental could, then yeah, they'd have a higher place on this list. But sadly, their damage does never seem to get better in 5-mans. They're actually really good in raids right now, so I expect that to be their niche. But yeah, I don't think their AoE component is ever going to work for 5-mans unless we're talking about mobs that are surviving for a very long time. Like if for some reason there's ever encounters in 5-mans where you're fighting 2-3 mobs constantly for like over a minute each trash-wise, then yes, maybe they'll be able to do good damage, kind of the same with Feral. But unfortunately, they don't bring Lust, they don't bring Battle Res, they don't bring anything really. So sadly, yes, they are relegated to the final spot. But I would like to remind you that all 4 of these, actually, the final tier here, they have a very, 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 very strong off-spec option. All 4 of these actually, so if not one of the best for each one. So we will talk about healers and tanks in another video. Thank you guys for watching, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the criteria and then wrap this up here. All right, so that's my tier list top to bottom. Next up, I want to talk about some of like the core mechanics and components of why I picked some of these things. We're just going to go through a list of them, and I'll tell you exactly why, so you understand where my head is coming from. The top tier, quote unquote, of these is grip. I'm talking about death grip, of course, not life grip. And the reason it's so important is because it is just an insane DPS increase for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of mobs in challenge modes and now Mythic Plus dungeons and everything in Legion in general. Some mobs are just really stubborn, and sometimes they don't want to conform to the pack that you're trying to create. So in this situation, especially this happens in Halls of Valor and Neltharian's Lair, gripping those types of mobs is an incredible DPS gain because everybody is going to be AoEing, especially, when we're pulling larger and you have like teaming and things like that. So without a grip, some of these packs go a lot slower, and that's just objective. effective. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. That is why DK is number 1 on overall list, and of course why grip is the most important thing. Second most important thing to me is battle res, and battle res has exceedingly become important. It used to be more important in WoD than I expected it to be because people would do a lot of controlled wiping to reset lust and save potions. That is no longer really an option in Mythic Plus. I don't think you'll see anybody doing that because now when you die, you lose some time. You lose some extra time other than the time it would take to recover from that death. So battle res is exceptionally important because if say 1 or 2 people die on a trash pack, first of all, obviously it takes a lot longer without them, but those deaths may also contribute to a full wipe. And if you actually, all 5 of you die, you lose even more time on top of the actual individual timers. So battle res is extremely important. If a healer or a tank dies and you have no battle res, you can very likely lose an entire run because of that. Next up on the list is stun. Stun is extremely important, and when I'm talking about stun, I'm talking about an AoE stun like leg sweep. This is another great, way to survive a pack. If you're pulling a really large pull, it would be a very good idea to have multiple stuns lined up in succession, not overriding each other. And using stuns properly is something that a lot of groups struggle to do. So when you have like a Windwalker who's already doing insane AoE DPS but can also bring leg sweep, then they are very useful. Same with like elemental, stuff like that. And then of course, talking about elemental, we have AG, off healing ability type that. This is really the only one that's still in the game if you ask me. The other options are very weak comparatively, and this actually has a really nice synergy with how well elemental plays. So I am very excited to see this in the game again. It was one of the main reasons why enhanced was just absolute god mode last expansion in WoD challenge modes, but having that back again with elemental being the user of it is really nice, and I like that type of thing, especially now because healers can do so much damage. Their affordability to not have to worry about healing is very nice. And then you have something like mobility. Like I discussed a little bit earlier, mobility is actually a really underwritten thing. You really need to understand that when you're in a dungeon, the entire dungeon is one encounter. So think of it that way in a boss fight. Anytime you're not attacking something, you're losing damage. Whether you want to call it DPS or just damage, relevant to me, the whole group is one encounter. The whole group has one encounter, and that's the dungeon. So everybody needs to be maximizing their DPS, their damage per second. And if you're not attacking something because you're a slow class or you're out of position, then you have effectively lost time. Good mobility is going to add seconds to every single pack, and over the course of a dungeon, that's going to add minutes to your time. And then durability, same thing, kind of like the opposite of battle res. If you can just survive the damage and you don't ever need to be battle resed, then that would be awesome as well. You're going to save your time a lot. But if you're somebody who dies constantly and you're doing great damage, then you're really hurting your group more than you're helping them, because having the battle res or having to lose that time on those deaths is really important. But unfortunately, there's not a great amount of durability between damage dealers anymore. A lot of that was homogenized and cut out. Yeah, I think Warlock, Mage, and Rogue are kind of the top tier in terms of that durability. So anyway, if you guys have any questions about this criteria or the tier list or anything like that, let me know. I enjoyed making this video, so we'll probably be doing one on tanks and healers, and that's that. See you guys in the next video.